Hi, I'm a Catholic priest, and I'm here to answer questions from social media about assisted suicide and the death penalty. This is part of a series for Respect Life Month, and we're going to take your questions. So these are both related to the end of life. So the first question is, why does the Catholic Church oppose assisted suicide, even in cases of extreme suffering? This is another complicated topic, so I want to begin by saying that many, if not most of us, if we have not already, will face a difficult situation of caregiving or receiving in which we will wrestle with these questions. There's much more detail and resources available at wholeperson.care, so I'd like to point you to that great resource. So why do we oppose assisted suicide? Well, for similar reasons to our opposition to suicide itself. No matter what difficulties or suffering someone is facing in life, we do not eliminate another person's suffering or our own by eliminating the person. We are persons created in the image and likeness of the living God, our Creator, and given inherent dignity and responsibility for our lives to God, to worship and to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. We believe there is a difference between killing and allowing natural death. This love of neighbor and the healing ministry of Christ has been at the core of the Catholic community, including our healthcare ministries, for centuries. Those ministries are about healing in body, mind, and spirit, and doing all we can to alleviate all aspects of suffering. When the focus becomes hastening dying intentionally, that fundamentally changes the role between physician and patient, or family member and patient. Part of the intensity around these debates is the difficulty that family members have in knowing how to love and how to provide excellent care for their family members in the midst of very difficult situations, difficult suffering. Even without the intentional hastening of death, we can doubt our actions or the actions of doctors at times. This issue comes up frequently in forums that we host at parishes on this topic. People want to know that they did what they could and that what they did was right and that their loved ones received the best care under the circumstances. Well, life is a gift from God, and we are not owners of our own lives, but stewards of God's gift of life and all of creation. We do not have absolute power over life, but we have a duty to preserve it and to use it for God's glory. However, the duty to preserve life is not absolute, and I'm going to read here from the FAQs from the Whole Person Care. The Church does not promote vitalism, preserving physical life at all costs, but rather asks us to embrace the virtues of fidelity, faithfulness to those in need, compassion, suffering with those who are suffering, and individual dignity. Food and water, for example, whether by mouth or by artificial means, are considered obligatory unless a person is imminently dying. However, the use of other technology may be optional depending on whether the means, the treatments, are ordinary or extraordinary. Now, what's the difference between ordinary and extraordinary means? Well, in this context, ordinary is obligatory, it's not usual. And extraordinary is optional. It's not unusual. There are two criteria. Both must be true for a therapy or a treatment to be ordinary and therefore obligatory. And those two are a reasonable prospect of benefit and not involve excessive expense, pain, or inconvenience. Ordinary means are all medicines, treatments, and operations which offer a reasonable hope of benefit and which can be obtained and used without excessive expense, pain, or inconvenience. Extraordinary means are all medicines, treatments, and operations which cannot be obtained or used without excessive expense, pain, or inconvenience, or which, if used, would not offer a reasonable hope of benefit. Now, that's not to say that one cannot avail themselves of extraordinary means, but it's just to say that it's not obligatory in that way, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. So we're going to take our next question, which comes from Twitter, from X. Elderly aunt needed O2, oxygen. Then it wasn't enough, so hospital. Assisted breathing dried out her throat, so no water or food allowed. Torture. was not getting better, so they, quote, made her comfortable with morphine and oxygen only. When is it mercy killing versus palliative care? Gray area. That's the end of the question. Our frequently asked questions show that a morphine, right, a strong opiate that offers the best, most common approach to severe pain relief, a drip or continuous infusion, is often used when a terminally ill patient is experiencing progressive or intense pain. A morphine drip or infusion is not prescribed to hasten a terminally ill patient's death, but to provide comfort to the patient. There is a method of gradually increasing strength of pain medicines as the pain changes with disease progression. Both the dosage and type of medicine can be changed to meet the individual's unique needs for relief and prevention of pain and discomfort. Beginning with mild to moderate to strongest medications, the physician has options to maintain control over the person's pain over time. This is something that's highly controlled and that doctors work very carefully to manage the pain. There is a distinct difference between the action of prescribing pain medication for a terminally ill patient and prescribing a lethal drug for a terminally ill patient. In the first case, the intent of the prescriber is to relieve pain, and the drug of choice would be an opiate such as morphine. In the second case, the intent of the prescriber is to purposefully hasten death, and the choice of drug would be a barbiturate. While it is true that the terminally ill patient's life may somewhat be shortened as a result of the ingestion of an opiate, that's not the intent of the prescriber. Catholic moral theology recognizes and accepts this situation, calling it the rule of double effect, and we saw this in the other video about abortion as well. Often the person who has struggled with pain for some time may be able to finally let go and die peacefully once they are no longer suffering. This can happen simultaneously, but it's rarely a direct result of the medication. The healthcare providers must assess and monitor and adjust the medication to achieve the proper dose and comfort balance. And again, this is something that doctors work very hard to do. Pope Pius XII actually had something to say about this. A group of physicians had asked, is the removal of pain and consciousness by means of narcotics permitted by religion and morality to both doctor and patient, even at the approach of death, and if one foresees that the use of narcotics will shorten the life? And the Pope answered, he said, yes, provided that no other means exist, and if in the given circumstances the action does not prevent the carrying out of other moral and religious duties. Death is by no means intended or sought, although the risk of it is being incurred for a good reason. He adds, the only intention is to diminish pain effectively by use of the painkillers available to medical science. So we don't ever withdraw care. We withdraw life-sustaining treatment at times and focus on goals of comfort as a person transitions into the end of their earthly life. And that's why it's so important that we have these conversations with others. We share our wishes around quality of life and consider what we would do in the event of a serious illness or injury. And we share that with others. It's why we encourage people to review the Church's teachings on end of life and to complete an advance directive in preparation for our mortality, so that we have a sense of what our values are, what our Church teaches, and how we will respond. Sickness and end of life needs this whole person care approach, and it's a continuum of care. And our initiative of caring for the whole person has a lot of resources for education of the faithful around these topics. And again, you can visit it at wholeperson.care. A lot of helpful downloads and resources, a lot of ways to educate ourselves on this topic. We have ministries that support accompaniment, such as parish home visitors and Eucharistic ministers to the homebound. Those are just a few of the many ways the Church strives to support and alleviate suffering and look for those who are in need in their homes and care for individuals and families and their caregivers. Our Office of Family Life lists resources on their webpage, has additional resources. Also, bereavement after a loss is a big part of how we provide care. And you can find those, including resources for parish grief groups at rcbo.org, bereavement grief. You can also find resources for aging and caregiving at rcbo.org/seniors. Now, the church is a leader in palliative care and is working to make excellence in palliative care, end-of-life care, a best practice for all of medicine, for all other institutions. Sadly, economic and other motives that fail to see the humanity of patients or otherwise look to hastening dying rather than excellence in care are making headway in our culture, and we've seen that. We saw that in California with our End-of-Life Options Act that went into effect in 2016. And since the effort against it, the California bishops advanced this Caring for the Whole Person initiative. And Bishop Vann has always said the no to assisted suicide always comes within the much bigger yes to quality and compassionate end-of-life care and accompaniment. And so that's what we seek to do. We insist on that, on accompaniment throughout illness and through the end of life, so that every person will know that they are loved, wanted, and worthy. The next question is what to say to someone who agrees with assisted suicide or who agrees with the death penalty. And this is getting us into our next topic as well. Well, first and foremost, we need to start by listening. We all have reasons for our beliefs, and typically even more significant are our own life experiences. If someone watched a loved one suffer at the end of life or had to make a difficult decision about withdrawal of care, they're much more likely to have strong opinions about assisted suicide. If someone was a victim of violent crime or close to someone who was the victim of violent crime, the question of the death penalty will probably sit with them very differently. However, it'd be a mistake to assume that we know how that is. We have to listen to them. Some of the most passionate advocates against the death penalty that I have met or listened to are those who were close to victims and who did not want to further violence and dehumanization by the killing of the perpetrator of those crimes. Of course, others see it differently and need to be heard as well. So we can educate one another on misunderstandings and the tragic consequences when the focus of end-of-life care becomes the hastening of death. In some countries now, patients with psychiatric disorders even, and not just terminal illness, now qualify for so-called aid in dying. So it is something we need to pay closely attention to. And while there's overlap, we have to distinguish here between those two end-of-life issues. One about the treatment of someone who's dying in the case of assisted suicide. The other, the state in our name choosing to kill. And the principle of not eliminating suffering or advancing justice by eliminating the person, again, relates to the death penalty as well. What's said in the ERD's ethical and religious directives applies to the death penalty here too. In the face of death, for many, a time when hope seems lost, the church witnesses to her belief that God has created each person for eternal life. The truth that life is a precious gift from God has profound implications for the question of stewardship over human life. This is true of those who are sitting on death row as well. Their lives, too, are precious in God's sight, and their dignity is not taken away by their crimes. As Brian Stevenson puts it, each of us is more than the worst thing we have ever done. The church's view has developed on this topic, and recently, on August 2nd, 2018, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, section 2268, was updated by the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith to reflect the church's evolving stance on capital punishment. Pope Francis said, "The death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and the dignity of the human person." A previous summary of that section, 2267, strongly discouraged the use of the death penalty, saying the practice was only permissible if there were no other way or means to keep society safe. Pope St. John Paul II already surprised many by including strong opposition to the death penalty in his encyclical, The Gospel of Life. And in the 2018 revision of the Catechism, there's closed any remaining loopholes of uncertainty around the death penalty and an affirmation of the more than 20 years of papal and church authority, public speaking out against its use. The next question here is, how does the church address the concept of justice and the need to protect society while still opposing the death penalty? Well, the church advocates for a restorative justice rather than a retributive justice approach. Previously, the death penalty was considered permissible only when there were no other means to keep society safe. Now there's a consensus that there are, in fact, other means, and we advocate for those. Even life without parole, though, has been called a secret death penalty by Pope Francis. See, punishment should only be towards the goal of rehabilitation and restoration. And life without parole, as with the death penalty, goes against the grain of the gospel, which is forgiveness without limits. That does not mean we don't work to keep danger at bay and keep people safe. However, one of the still untold stories about prison and the death penalty is how fundamentally unjust it actually is. The death penalty actually feeds vengeance and retribution. The death penalty disproportionately affects people of color, the poor, and those with intellectual disabilities and severe mental illness. Contrary to popular belief, the death penalty is not a deterrent and does not make society safer. We don't kill in order to teach people not to kill. It's also geographically arbitrary. Roughly 2% of this nation's counties have produced both a majority of all executions imposed since 1976 and of prisoners waiting execution on death row. A handful of states carry out the majority of executions, and they are the former slave states, a continuing legacy of slavery and lynching. Now, California has the most people on death row, but we have had a moratorium on executions and some dismantling of death row. However, we are still in need of a legal change to abolish the death penalty in our state, and that's something to stay tuned. You'll be hearing more about. The death penalty does not bring healing to victims' families. It denies our call to care for the least of these, and on top of all that, it also threatens innocent life. The Innocence Project and the work of the Equal Justice Initiative and others have demonstrated that innocent persons are killed, and they are on death row. They have also demonstrated the linkages between our practice of the death penalty, mass incarceration, and the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in the United States. So thanks for joining us today. Our next topic is going to be on social justice, the other life issues as a part of our Respect Life Month series. So join us then and every week.